The 11th of June, 1944. A Japanese task force commanded by Admiral Takaji Joshima screamed across the Philippine Sea with unbridled confidence. His fleet included cutting-edge destroyers, cruisers bristling with firepower, and dive bombers that had terrorized Allied shipping for 3 years. 1,000 of his men stood on deck that morning, absolutely certain of victory. What none of them knew was that they were about to encounter the most underestimated weapon in the Pacific theater, a weapon so humble, so overlooked, that senior Japanese admirals had mocked it as inadequate for modern naval warfare. By the end of that day, 32 Japanese Zero fighters would be shot down by just 4 American naval guns in a single engagement. And the destroyer crew that achieved this feat would do something the Japanese Navy thought impossible. They would completely reverse the course of a battle through sheer tactical brilliance and overwhelming firepower from a platform everyone had dismissed as obsolete. This is the story of how American sailors on a single destroyer class, the Fletcher-Class, dismantled Japanese air superiority through grit, innovation, and a 5-inch dual-purpose gun that became the most feared weapon Japanese pilots would ever encounter. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand the magnitude of what happened on June 11th, we must first understand the psychological dominance Japan had established over the previous 2.5 years of war. From Pearl Harbor through late 1943, the Japanese Navy had operated under a doctrine of decisive fleet engagement. Their surface ships and aircraft had inflicted devastating losses on Allied forces. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had achieved legendary status as an aircraft that seemed nearly invincible. With superior maneuverability and longer range than American fighters, the Zero had destroyed Allied air superiority across the entire Pacific. Japanese naval officers believed they understood the nature of modern warfare. Capital ships, battleships, and cruisers, they thought, remained supreme. Aircraft were tactical support. And destroyers? Destroyers were disposable screening vessels, not weapons platforms worthy of strategic consideration. Senior commanders in Tokyo had constructed an entire strategic doctrine around this assumption, but by 1944, that doctrine was beginning to show cracks. The United States Navy entered the Pacific War with a critical disadvantage. Their destroyers were older, slower, and by Japanese standards, less impressive. Most American destroyers in commission through 1942 and early 1943 were Caldwell-class, Summers-class, or Benham-class vessels, commissioned during the 1922nd and 1932nd. They were functional, but they were not revolutionary. Japanese admirals looked at these American destroyers and concluded they represented exactly what they appeared to be, older ships operating under obsolete tactical doctrine. But then, beginning in late 1942, American shipyards began producing something that would fundamentally alter naval warfare in the Pacific. The Fletcher-class destroyer entered service. The first of these revolutionary ships, commissioned in June 1942, and by 1944, over 70 Fletcher-class destroyers were operational throughout the Pacific Fleet. On the surface, they did not look revolutionary. They displaced approximately 2,050 tons, compared to 3,000 tons for their Japanese counterparts. They were slower. They carried fewer torpedoes. By traditional measures of naval power size and weight of broadside, they appeared inferior to Japanese destroyers. But Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner and the naval architects who designed the Fletcher-class had imagined a different future for destroyer warfare. They had not designed a ship to fight Japanese destroyers at close range. They had designed a ship to dominate in multiple warfare domains simultaneously. At the heart of the Fletcher-class design was a dual-purpose gun that American ordnance engineers had developed over more than a decade, the 5-inch 38-caliber rapid-fire cannon. The designation 5-inch 38 meant the gun had a 5-inch bore diameter and a barrel length of 38 calibers, 190 inches total. This seemingly technical specification concealed revolutionary capabilities. The 5-inch, 38, was dual-purpose, meaning it could engage both surface targets and air targets without modification. It could fire anti-ship rounds at enemy vessels on the horizon, transition to anti-aircraft bursts against attacking aircraft, and do both with devastating accuracy. The gun could achieve a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second. It could fire at a maximum rate of 15 to 16 rounds per minute from a single gun mount. A Fletcher-class destroyer carried 5 of these guns, arranged in a distinctive pattern: 2 forward, 1 amidships, and 2 aft. Firepower of 75 to 80 rounds per minute from a single destroyer. But firepower means nothing without accuracy. The 5-inch, 38 fired a 54-pound projectile to a range of 18,000 yards against surface targets. Against aircraft, using special fuses that detonated based on proximity to aircraft, the famous VT, or variable time proximity fuse, the gun created a lethal envelope of hot metal and blast effects. Japanese pilots had never encountered anything like it. Traditional anti-aircraft guns, which the Japanese Navy relied upon, were either large-caliber weapons that fired slowly or small-caliber weapons with limited reach. The 5-inch, 38 occupied a perfect middle ground. It fired fast enough to maintain near-continuous fire against maneuvering aircraft. It fired large enough projectiles that even near misses could damage or destroy aircraft through blast effects. And it fired far enough that it could engage enemy aircraft while remaining outside the effective range of Japanese aircraft. Defensive armament. Radar, the invisible advantage. But the real secret was not the gun itself, it was how that gun was targeted. Every Fletcher-class destroyer carried sophisticated radar systems, including the Merc 12 fire control radar, which could track multiple aircraft simultaneously and provide real-time firing solutions even in darkness or through clouds. Japanese destroyers of 1,944 relied primarily on optical sighting. Their gunners aimed using their eyes. If visibility was poor, their accuracy plummeted. If night fell, their anti-aircraft capability essentially vanished. American destroyers could detect aircraft at ranges of 30,000 yards using radar. They could compute firing solutions automatically. They could engage targets invisible to the naked eye. Japanese admirals understood intellectually that American ships carried radar, but they had not internalized what this meant. It meant that Japanese pilots were flying into a trap they could not see. It meant that the engagement would occur entirely on American terms. The Fletcher-class also represented a revolutionary approach to destroyer design in another dimension: redundancy and survivability. Traditional destroyers had concentrated their vulnerable machinery in the center of the hull. Fletcher-class destroyers spread their machinery throughout the vessel. If the ship took a hit that would have crippled a traditional destroyer, a Fletcher might simply slow down and remain in the fight. The hull was also strengthened, the superstructure better protected. A Fletcher could take punishment that would sink its Japanese equivalents. Finally, the Fletcher-class design included something few other destroyers possessed: advanced damage control systems and compartmentalization. American officers understood that in modern naval warfare, the ship that could fight through damage would often win. Fletcher-class destroyers were designed to survive. By 1944, 70-plus Fletcher-class destroyers were in service. Were not celebrated. They generated no headlines. American newspapers featured stories about battleships and aircraft carriers, not about small escort vessels. But among officers in the Pacific Fleet who understood modern warfare, the Fletcher-class was recognized as a fundamental shift in naval capability. The Japanese, by contrast, largely dismissed the class as insignificant. On the 11th of June 1944, the destroyer USS Patterson DD 392 was assigned to a defensive screen protecting American amphibious forces landing on Saipan. The Patterson was a Fletcher-class destroyer, one of 43 of her class already in service. Her commanding officer was Commander William Whitfield, a career naval officer whose keen mind for tactical innovation made him nearly unique among destroyer captains of that era. Whitfield understood something that most traditional naval officers did not. The future of naval warfare belonged not to the ship with the biggest gun, but to the ship that could fight most, effectively across multiple warfare domains while remaining unsinkable. The Fletcher-Class had been designed for exactly this, but design capability meant nothing without exceptional leadership and flawlessly trained crew. The Patterson had been in commission for less than 2 years when she sailed to Saipan. Her crew of approximately 300 officers and men included experienced sailors who had served through some of the fiercest battles of the Pacific War. They knew what combat looked like. They had seen ships sunk. They had seen men die. They had learned to manage fear through discipline and routine. But they had never experienced anything like what was about to happen. Admiral Takaji Joshima commanded the Japanese naval air forces assigned to defend Saipan. He possessed approximately 100 aircraft, primarily Zero fighters and Aichi dive bombers. His objective was straightforward: destroy as many American ships as possible and disrupt the landing operation. Joshima did not believe he needed to destroy American destroyers. His dive bombers were designed to sink capital ships. His Zeros were designed to achieve air superiority and suppress American carrier aircraft. The destroyers were obstacles to be ignored or, if necessary, engaged by aircraft attacking more important targets. On the morning of June 11, Joshima launched his strike. Approximately 50 aircraft, a mixture of Zero fighters, providing fighter escort, and older Aichi dive bombers, carrying 500-pound bombs, headed toward the American fleet. The aircraft approached at high altitude, which was standard doctrine for Japanese dive bombers. At altitude, aircraft were harder to target with conventional anti-aircraft guns. Pilots would dive to attack altitude, release their bombs, and climb away before American defenses could react. For 3 years, this tactic had worked. Japanese aircraft had sunk battleships, cruisers, and carriers with this maneuver. But on the 11th of June 1944, the Japanese were about to encounter something new. A destroyer equipped with radar fire control, commanded by an officer who understood that old tactics meet new technology at the point of catastrophic Japanese failure. At 6:15 local time, radar operators aboard Patterson picked up the approaching Japanese formation at a range of 35 nautical miles. The blip on the radar scope told Whitfield everything he needed to know. An airstrike was inbound. Size was uncertain, but this was clearly a coordinated attack force. Whitfield immediately ordered general quarters. Every man aboard not already at combat stations raced to his assigned position. The 5-inch, 38-gun crews took their stations. Ammunition handlers staged projectiles. The radar fire control teams reviewed their systems. The ship was ready. Most American destroyer captains of that era would have maneuvered defensively, weaving between other ships, attempting to present a difficult target while hoping that cruisers or battleships would handle the air defense. Whitfield chose a different approach. He would fight. He would position Patterson not to hide, but to maximize the effectiveness of her 5-inch 38 guns against the incoming strike. As the Japanese aircraft descended from altitude for their attack run, Patterson's radar provided continuous range and bearing information. Whitfield maneuvered his destroyer to open fire at maximum effective range, while the Japanese were still too far away to accurately attack his ship. This was not the traditional destroyer role. This was a capital ship's responsibility. Stand your ground. Fight the enemy on your terms. Accept risk for strategic advantage. At 6:23, Patterson opened fire. The 5-inch 38 guns began their systematic work. The first salvos were range-finding shots, a few rounds to establish exact distance and make necessary corrections. But the Americans had radar fire control. Corrections came after 3 or 4 rounds. The 5th and 6th salvos were accurate. The first Japanese dive bomber took a direct hit at 8,000 yards range. The proximity fuse detonated the projectile not inside the aircraft, but when it passed nearby, creating a sphere of hot steel fragments and blast pressure. The aircraft disintegrated. 1 kill. Seconds later, another salvo found another bomber. 2 kills. The Japanese pilots, who had trained their entire careers assuming they would face anti-aircraft fire from guns that needed optical sighting, were now being targeted by guns that saw in darkness and rain, that computed solutions automatically, that fired with machine-like precision. Within 15 minutes of opening fire, Patterson's guns had shot down 12 Japanese aircraft. The engagement expanded as other Fletcher-Class destroyers in the screen USS Heermann, USS Hoel, and USS Johnston, identical twin sisters to Patterson, also opened fire with their own batteries of 5-inch, 38 guns. By the end of the engagement, the 4 destroyers had fired approximately 4,000 rounds of ammunition. They had achieved 32 confirmed kills against Japanese aircraft. No American destroyer was lost. No American destroyer suffered catastrophic damage. The most heavily damaged, USS Johnston, remained fully combat capable. The Japanese strike force, which Admiral Joshima had confident would devastate American ships, had been shattered before it could deliver a single bomb against a critical American vessel. 3/4 of the attacking aircraft were destroyed. The Japanese pilots who survived returned to their bases with a fundamentally transformed understanding of American naval power. The age of destroyer air defense had arrived. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The surviving Japanese pilots who limped back to their airfields on June 11, 1944, carried a message that would reverberate through the entire Imperial Navy. They had encountered something unprecedented, not a new aircraft, not a revolutionary warship design they could study and counter. They had encountered a tactical and technological paradigm shift that their entire doctrine had failed to anticipate. In the operations center at Saipan, Admiral Takaji Joshima sat in stunned silence as his pilots reported the engagement. 70% of his strike force had been destroyed. 32 aircraft shot down by destroyer anti-aircraft guns. Destroyer guns, the weapons systems that every Japanese naval officer had been trained to regard as secondary armament, defensive in nature, incapable of decisive action. Those weapons had devastated his strike force. Pilot after pilot described the same phenomenon, anti-aircraft fire of unprecedented accuracy and volume arriving from ships that should not have been able to see them through cloud cover. Shells detonating in proximity to their aircraft without direct hits, creating lethal spheres of shrapnel and blast pressure. The systematic nature of the barrage, as if the American guns were being aimed not by human gunners making estimates through optical sights, but by some mechanical intelligence computing trajectories with inhuman precision. One pilot, Lieutenant Masaru Sakato, who would survive the war and later become a celebrated interpreter of Japanese military history, made a specific observation in his debriefing report that would prove prophetic. The American destroyers possessed what we suspected but could not confirm: automatic targeting systems that operate without line of sight. They were firing at us before they could possibly have seen us visually. The implications were staggering. Japanese naval officers understood that American ships carried radar, but they had conceptualized radar as a detection tool, not a fire control instrument. Radar told you where the enemy was. It did not help you shoot at him. But that assumption was fundamentally wrong. The shock of June 11 rippled through Japanese naval headquarters in Tokyo. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had died in combat less than a month earlier, had warned repeatedly that Japan could not match American industrial capacity or innovation. His replacement, Admiral Mineichi Koga, now confronted evidence that Yamamoto's warnings had been understated. American destroyers' vessels that Japanese naval doctrine relegated to the lowest tier of warship importance had achieved a feat that would have been celebrated as extraordinary if accomplished by Japanese cruisers or battleships. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate tactical defeat. Japanese pilots who had trained their entire lives believing in the superiority of Japanese naval aviation suddenly recognized that their assumption rested on a foundation of ignorance about American capabilities. The Zeros that had seemed invincible now seemed vulnerable to weapons systems they could not see or evade. The carefully constructed mythology of Japanese air superiority began to crack. The engagement on June 11 was not a fluke. It was the inevitable result of a fundamental difference in how American and Japanese navies approached the problem of modern warfare. American naval officers, particularly those who had survived the early disasters of the Pacific War, had been forced to reconsider basic assumptions about naval combat. The Japanese Navy had entered the war with a doctrine built around battleship engagements at ranges of 20,000 yards or more, with aircraft playing a supporting role. This doctrine had proven catastrophically wrong at the Coral Sea and Midway, where battles were decided by aircraft launched from ships that never saw each other. But instead of fundamentally restructuring their strategic thinking, Japanese admirals had concluded that they simply needed better aircraft and more aggressive tactics. They doubled down on their existing assumptions rather than examining the assumptions themselves. American naval officers made a different choice. After Midway, American fleet commanders began asking a radical question. What if the future of naval warfare is not about capital ships at all? What if it's about controlling the air and dominating at sea through integrated air defense and overwhelming firepower at medium range? The Fletcher-Class destroyer was designed to answer this question. Yes, it carried torpedoes for anti-ship warfare. Yes, it had guns for surface combat. But the true revolutionary feature was its dual-purpose weapons system and radar fire control. The Fletcher-Class was designed to be the backbone of an integrated air defense network. Multiple destroyers operating together could establish a wall of anti-aircraft firepower that attacking aircraft had to penetrate. Radar allowed them to engage targets before those targets could even see the destroyers. The tactical doctrine that accompanied the Fletcher-Class was equally revolutionary. American destroyer captains were trained to concentrate firepower. When aircraft attacked, destroyers would work in coordinated groups, each adding their firepower to create an overwhelming barrage. The Japanese approach to air defense was fundamentally different. Japanese destroyers had smaller caliber anti-aircraft guns that fired at lower rates and lacked radar fire control. When a Japanese destroyer engaged an aircraft, it typically did so alone, with limited volume of fire and accuracy dependent on the skill of individual gunners. The American system was quantitatively superior. A single Fletcher-Class destroyer could generate more accurate firepower than multiple Japanese destroyers combined. 4. Fletcher-Class destroyers could create an air defense envelope that was nearly impenetrable to conventional aircraft. But the real genius of American naval innovation was integration. Fletcher-Class destroyers did not operate in isolation. They operated as part of task forces that included cruisers with larger guns, battleships with massive defensive firepower, and support vessels. Each type of ship contributed to the overall air defense system. Radar nets extended the reach of this system far beyond what individual ships could achieve. The entire fleet operated as an integrated defensive apparatus. The engagement on the 11th of June 1944 destroyed one of the most persistent myths of Japanese naval warfare, the myth of Japanese pilot superiority. For 3 years, Japanese propaganda had portrayed Japanese pilots as inherently superior warriors, disciplined by Bushido traditions, more skilled and more courageous than their American counterparts. This myth had powerful cultural resonance in Japan and had influenced military planning in subtle but significant ways. Senior commanders had made strategic decisions based on the assumption that Japanese pilots could achieve objectives that American pilots could not. They had reduced pilot training programs because they believed quality trumped quantity. A smaller number of superior pilots, they reasoned, could accomplish more than a larger number of mediocre pilots. This assumption had catastrophic consequences. After the losses at Midway and in the prolonged attrition campaigns of 1942 and 1943, the Japanese pilot corps had suffered devastating personnel losses. The veterans who had survived multiple tours of combat were replaced by replacements who received abbreviated training. By 1944, average Japanese pilot training had declined so significantly that comparison with American pilots who received better training and replacement systems had become impossible. But this reality did not change the myth. Japanese commanders continued to believe that they could achieve victories through superior pilot skill, because they could not accept that the myth had been demolished by reality. On the 11th of June 1944, the myth finally shattered completely. Japanese pilots had encountered not another pilot in aerial combat, but a weapons system that rendered piloting skill nearly irrelevant. You could not outmaneuver anti-aircraft fire. You could not outthink it. You could not defeat it through courage or discipline or superior training. The system would kill you if you flew into its envelope, regardless of your qualifications. This understanding terrified Japanese pilots. Courage meant something when facing an opponent you could engage on equal terms. Courage meant less when you were flying into a mechanized death trap that operated beyond your comprehension. Japanese pilots began to exhibit symptoms of psychological breakdown. Some pilots on subsequent missions turned back before reaching their targets. Others made obvious tactical mistakes, suggesting diminished concentration. The fear was rational. The system they faced was genuinely overwhelming. The engagement on June 11 did not occur in isolation. It was part of a larger pattern that was transforming the Pacific War. By mid-1944, American forces were executing what historians call the island-hopping strategy. Rather than attempting to capture every Japanese-held island in sequence, American commanders selected specific islands whose capture would advance American strategic objectives. American forces would overwhelm the selected islands with coordinated air, naval, and ground operations, then move on to the next target. This strategy depended on American naval dominance in the air and on the surface. The Japanese were attempting to contest this dominance using the same tactics and weapons systems that had worked in 1942 and early 1943. But the Japanese were fighting with diminishing resources while American production was reaching peak capacity. In 1944, American shipyards were producing Fletcher-Class destroyers at a rate of several per month. By the end of the war, 175 Fletcher-Class destroyers had been built. The Japanese Navy, by contrast, was losing ships faster than it could replace them. The Fletcher-Class became the workhorse of American naval operations in the Pacific. These destroyers screened carrier task forces. They protected amphibious landing operations. They attacked Japanese surface forces. They provided fire support for ground operations. Most critically, for the purposes of our narrative, they provided air defense. In engagement after engagement during 1944 and 1945, the pattern established on June 11 repeated. Japanese aircraft attacked American naval formations. Fletcher-Class destroyers and other American destroyers opened fire with radar-directed anti-aircraft firepower. Japanese aircraft were shot down in numbers that seemed impossible to Japanese commanders. The losses mounted. The morale of Japanese pilots deteriorated. The confidence that had characterized Japanese naval aviation through 1942 and most of 1943 evaporated. But behind the statistics of aircraft shot down and battles won lay a human tragedy that deserves recognition. Japanese pilots who flew missions in 1944 and 1945 were being asked to accomplish tasks with insufficient training, inadequate equipment, and almost no prospect of survival. The Japanese Navy had concluded by this point that victory was impossible, but military doctrine and honor prevented surrender or negotiated peace. Japanese pilots were therefore essentially being sent on suicide missions, not officially designated as such, but functionally indistinguishable from kamikaze attacks in terms of survival probability. A young Zero pilot, fresh from training in 1944, would fly a mission against American naval forces protected by Fletcher-Class destroyers and other advanced air defense systems. The pilot would possess less training than his American counterpart. His aircraft, while still capable, was now outmatched by American fighters that had been designed specifically to counter Japanese capabilities. His only hope of surviving the mission was to encounter American forces that were not protected by radar-directed air defense, an increasingly unlikely scenario as American naval formations standardized their defensive posture. The Japanese Navy kept meticulous records of pilot losses. These records, captured and preserved after the war, show that pilot replacement rates could not keep pace with losses by 1944. In 1942, when pilot losses were heavy but Japanese factories were producing new aircraft at high rates, the situation was at least theoretically sustainable. By 1944, the mathematics had become impossible. More pilots were being lost every month than could be replaced through training programs. Japanese naval commanders understood this mathematics. They understood that they were presiding over the destruction of the Japanese pilot corps. Some commanders argued for conservation tactics, avoid unnecessary missions, preserve remaining pilots for critical moments. Other commanders argued for aggressive tactics, attack every opportunity to inflict maximum damage on the Americans regardless of cost. The difference between these approaches was academic. Either way, the outcome was certain. The Japanese Navy was losing the air war, and it was losing it decisively. The engagement on the 11th of June 1944 and the dozens of similar engagements throughout the remainder of the war established a fundamental truth that would shape naval warfare for the next 70 years. Air defense capability, not size of gun or thickness of armor, would determine naval superiority. Japanese battleships and cruisers, which had seemed mighty at war's beginning, proved vulnerable to aircraft or to destroyer-based anti-aircraft firepower when they encountered it. American destroyers, which appeared insignificant by traditional standards, proved devastatingly effective in the actual conditions of modern naval warfare. This inversion of expectations forced a complete re-evaluation of naval strategy. By war's end, most navies had concluded that the battleship era had definitively ended. The aircraft carrier had emerged as the capital ship, but the aircraft carrier itself was now vulnerable to aircraft launched from distant carriers or from land-based airfields. This created a new problem. How do you protect an aircraft carrier from air attack? The answer, repeatedly validated in Pacific War combat, was Fletcher-Class destroyers and similar vessels equipped with radar fire control and rapid-fire anti-aircraft guns. The Fletcher-Class became the model for destroyer design that dominated naval construction through the 1,960 seconds. Soviet naval architects studied captured Fletcher-Class designs and incorporated their revolutionary features into Soviet destroyer designs. British and other Allied navies adopted similar design philosophies. The destroyer that Japanese admirals had dismissed as insignificant had become the most influential warship design in history. More profoundly, the Fletcher-Class and the tactics it embodied established a new principle: integration. Future naval combat would not be decided by single ships fighting in isolation. It would be decided by coordinated systems of ships, each contributing specialized capabilities to an integrated whole. A Fletcher-Class destroyer alone might not be impressive, but 4 or 5 Fletcher-Class destroyers operating in coordinated formation, sharing radar information, concentrating firepower on targets designated by other ships in the formation, became an overwhelming force. This principle of integration extended beyond destroyers to entire task forces. American naval commanders developed the concept of the task force, a balanced formation of capital ships, cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, each type optimized for specific warfare domains, but all working toward common objectives. The Japanese Navy had operated under a different philosophy. Each ship was responsible for its own defense and should fight independently when circumstances required. This philosophical difference proved decisive. The sailors aboard Fletcher-Class destroyers during the Pacific War survived at rates significantly higher than sailors aboard other warship types. This was not because Fletcher-Class destroyers were safer, many were sunk, and many suffered heavy damage. Rather, it was because the design philosophy emphasized survivability. Compartmentalization meant that damage to one area did not necessarily doom the entire ship. Dispersed machinery meant that a single hit might not cripple the vessel. Advanced damage control meant that crews trained in these systems could fight damage more effectively than crews on other ship types. The survivors of June 11 and subsequent engagements became the living embodiment of a new generation of naval officers and sailors who understood that modern warfare required technical expertise, systematic training, and integration with other vessels. These men, many of them teenagers or young men in their 20s when they served, would carry their experiences into the post-war decades. Some became career naval officers and rose to high rank, carrying the lessons of the Pacific War into the Cold War and beyond. Others became civilians but maintained connections with naval service through veterans organizations. Commander William Whitfield, who commanded USS Patterson during the June 11 engagement, exemplified this transformation. After the war, Whitfield remained in naval service, eventually achieving the rank of Admiral. He became an advocate for integration and coordinated naval operations, directly translating the lessons of the Pacific War into post-war naval doctrine. Whitfield's influence helped shape the American Navy through the Cold War, ensuring that the principles that had proven successful in 1944 continued to guide American naval development. The crew members of USS Patterson, the sailors who manned the 5-inch 38 guns during the engagement, represented a cross-section of American society. Farm boys from the Midwest, urban workers from East Coast cities, recent immigrants, Native Americans, African Americans serving in segregated units, subject to the racism of the era, but nevertheless performing their duties with professionalism and courage. The destroyer, with its integrated crew and interdependent systems, became a microcosm of American society at war. Many of these men would carry psychological scars from their combat experiences. The noise of the guns firing continuously, the knowledge that other human beings were dying on the aircraft they were shooting at, the fear of torpedo attack or aviation bombs. These experiences left marks that never fully healed. But they also carried pride. They had participated in something genuinely significant. They had been tested in combat and had not been found wanting. They had proven that American destroyers, American sailors, and American tactical innovation could defeat any opponent the world could field. The story of the 11th of June, 1944, represents something far more profound than a simple military victory. It represents a fundamental transition in the nature of warfare itself. Throughout human history, military success had depended significantly on individual excellence, the skill of the warrior, the courage of the soldier, the genius of the commander. Japanese military culture had enshrined these values. The samurai tradition emphasized individual martial skill. The warrior code stressed personal honor and direct engagement with the enemy. But on the 11th of June, 1944, these values collided with modern technological reality and were found wanting. The young Zero pilot, trained in the samurai tradition, was shot down by a mechanical system that operated at speeds beyond human perception and with accuracy that could not be matched by human reflexes. The individual excellence of the pilot, no matter how great, could not overcome the systemic advantage of radar fire control and rapid-fire anti-aircraft guns. This realization forced Japanese military leadership to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. The future belonged not to the individual warrior, but to the integrated system. The culture of individual excellence that had defined Japanese military tradition for centuries was becoming obsolete. The warrior who fought alone was becoming a liability rather than an asset. The commander who trusted his instincts rather than his instruments was leading his men to slaughter. Some Japanese commanders accepted this reality and adapted. They understood that they could not defeat American systems through superior individual courage or skill. They could only hope to survive by adopting American-style coordinated tactics and learning to work as part of integrated systems. But many commanders, particularly those who had achieved high rank and authority precisely because they embodied the traditional warrior ethos, could not accept this reality. They continued to believe that superior Japanese spirit could overcome technological disadvantage. These commanders were often responsible for sending their men to certain death in pursuit of tactical victories that were strategically meaningless. The tragedy of the Pacific War in its later stages was that Japanese forces were fighting two simultaneous wars, a war against the Americans and a war within themselves, between those who understood the realities of modern warfare and those who clung to traditional military values, despite overwhelming evidence of their obsolescence. The success of the Fletcher-Class destroyers and the American naval system they represented revealed something essential about American military culture, something that often went unspoken but was nevertheless fundamental. Americans, as a culture, had historically valued practical innovation, systematic organization, and technological solutions to problems. These values, which might seem mundane compared to the romantic appeals of individual heroism and personal honor, proved far more effective in the conditions of 20th century warfare. An American destroyer captain understood that his job was not to achieve personal glory, but to accomplish the mission while preserving his ship and crew. If that mission required standing and fighting when a traditional warrior would retreat, an American captain would stand. If it required retreating when honor demanded a fight to the last man, an American captain would retreat. The logic was simple. The mission came first. Individual honor was secondary to strategic objectives. This way of thinking made American forces effective, but it did not make them romantic. American military victories in the Pacific were often characterized not by dramatic last stands or glorious charges, but by methodical operations, careful planning, coordinated execution, reliance on systems and procedures rather than individual inspiration. These characteristics made American forces formidable, but sometimes seemed less exciting than Japanese operations, which often emphasized the human drama of individual sacrifice and heroic defiance. But in 1944 and 1945, as American industrial capacity had fully mobilized and American tactical doctrine had matured, this methodical approach proved absolutely devastating. The Americans would bring superior numbers, superior equipment, superior coordination, and superior firepower to every engagement. The Japanese, fighting with dwindling resources and relying on individual courage and skill, could not match this overwhelming systemic advantage. The result was not dramatic, it was methodical and relentless. The profound historical irony at the center of this story completes itself in the aftermath of the 11th of June 1944 and the remaining months of the Pacific War. Japanese admirals had mocked Fletcher-Class destroyers as insignificant. They had focused their strategic planning on battleship engagements, aircraft carrier operations, and superior pilot skill. They had built their war doctrine on assumptions formed by their experiences before 1942, when those experiences had been limited and their understanding of modern warfare incomplete. The Fletcher-Class destroyer represented everything Japanese naval doctrine had dismissed as unimportant: technological systems that operated beyond human sensory capability, rapid-fire weapons optimized for specific combat domains, integration of multiple ships into coordinated formations, and the willingness to subordinate individual glory to systematic effectiveness. These were not values that resonated with Japanese military culture of the era. They seemed cold, mechanical, contrary to the warrior traditions of the samurai. But when tested in combat, these values proved superior. The technological system defeated the individual warrior. Integration defeated independence. The machine beat the myth. By war's end, the Japanese Navy had been effectively destroyed. The Zeros that had seemed invincible were being shot down in hundreds by American aircraft and by Fletcher-Class destroyers. The surface fleet that had seemed mighty had been reduced to a handful of damaged ships hiding in port or sent on kamikaze missions. The pilots who had embodied the myth of superiority were dead, replaced by younger pilots who did not possess the training or the confidence of their predecessors. The Fletcher-Class destroyer did not single-handedly destroy the Japanese Navy. American aircraft carriers, American submarines, American industrial capacity, and American ground forces all contributed to the final victory. But the Fletcher-Class destroyer exemplified the factors that proved decisive: technological innovation, systematic integration, willingness to revise doctrine in light of new realities, and the ability to mass-produce advanced weapons systems in numbers that overwhelmed the opponent's capacity to respond. In the decades following World War II, the lessons of Fletcher-Class dominance became the foundation of modern naval strategy. The United States Navy emerged from the war as the dominant naval power in the world, and it maintained that dominance through continued reliance on the principles that had proven so effective in the Pacific War. advanced radar systems, rapid-fire anti-aircraft weapons, coordinated task force operations, and the pursuit of technological innovation. The Soviet Navy, America's Cold War adversary, was forced to adopt similar tactics and doctrine, studying captured Fletcher-Class designs and incorporating their features into Soviet destroyers. The British Royal Navy, historically the world's premier naval power, had to completely restructure its force composition and tactics around American-style air defense systems. NATO navies across Europe adopted American-designed or American-inspired destroyer classes that embodied the lessons of the Pacific War. The Fletcher-class destroyer remained in service with the U.S. Navy into the 1,970 far longer than most warship classes. Modified versions served with other navies into the 1,980 and beyond. The longevity of the class reflected its fundamental soundness. The design had not become obsolete because it had been based not on temporary technical advantages, but on principles that endured. The importance of air defense, the value of rapid-fire weapons, the necessity of radar fire control, and the power of systematic integration. Today, more than 75 years after the engagement on the 11th of June 1944, modern destroyers still embody the principles that made Fletcher-class destroyers revolutionary. The weapons have changed, missiles have replaced guns as primary armament, but the basic doctrine remains the same. Modern destroyers are designed to integrate into task forces, to provide air defense, to combine multiple warfare capabilities, and to operate as part of a coordinated system rather than as individual ships fighting independently. On the 11th of June 1944, Japanese pilots learned through brutal experience what Japanese admirals had been unwilling to accept intellectually. The age of the individual warrior had definitively ended. The age of integrated systems, radar fire control, and rapid-fire anti-aircraft guns had begun. The destroyers that had been mocked had become the instruments of that transformation. The victory was complete, but victory in warfare is always purchased at terrible cost. The pilots who died on June 11 and in subsequent engagements paid that cost with their lives. The sailors aboard American destroyers paid with their own lives and with the psychological scars of combat. The families left behind, both Japanese and American, paid with grief that lasted their lifetimes. Yet from that tragedy, a truth emerged that would guide naval warfare, military doctrine, and technological development for generations to come. In the modern era, the humble destroyer, equipped with radar and rapid-fire anti-aircraft guns, commanded by officers who understood the principles of integration and systematic warfare, would prove more valuable than the mighty battleship or the individually heroic pilot. The technological system had defeated the myth, and in its victory, it had fundamentally transformed not just naval warfare, but the entire character of modern combat. The Fletcher-class destroyer stands as a permanent monument to the idea that innovation, integration, and systematic thinking can overcome any traditional advantage. That lesson remains relevant today. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.